Two guided missile destroyers slicing through the Persian Gulf. On the surface, this looks like routine deterrence, a flex of American naval power meant to send a message to Tehran. But here is the thing about messages sent through steel and sonar. They almost never say what they appear to say. And if you have been watching the slow, grinding tectonic shifts beneath the surface of global power for the last decade, you already sense that something far more consequential is happening right now. Something that has very little to do with Iran and everything to do with who gets to write the rules of the next world order. So stay with me, because about 2/3 through this conversation, I am going to share with you a critical realization about why this naval deployment may actually represent the last move in a game that America is losing, not on the water, but in the boardroom, the bazaar, and the ballot boxes of the global south. Let us start with what we actually know. The United States Navy has positioned two Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers in waters adjacent to Iran. The official narrative, as dutifully reported by every mainstream outlet from CNN to the Wall Street Journal, frames this as a response to Iranian aggression, a protective measure for commercial shipping, and a reaffirmation of American commitment to freedom of navigation in one of the world's most strategically critical waterways. And on that narrow surface-level reading, there is nothing technically false about that framing. But a map of the chessboard that only shows you 4 squares is not a map. It is a blindfold. To understand why this deployment matters beyond the headlines, we have to travel back in time just a few years and ask ourselves a very uncomfortable question. Why has American military posturing in the Middle East consistently failed to produce the stability it promises? Think about that honestly for a moment. Since 2001, the United States has spent somewhere in the neighborhood of $8 trillion on military operations across the greater Middle East. $8 trillion. And what is the strategic balance sheet today? Iran is stronger than it was in 2001. It has a nuclear program that is weeks away from weaponization capacity, according to the IAEA's own assessments. Its proxy network, Hezbollah, the Houthis, various Iraqi militias, has survived every attempt to dismantle it, and its relationship with Russia and China has moved from cautious pragmatism to something that looks increasingly like a strategic alliance. So we have to ask with genuine intellectual seriousness whether this deployment of destroyers is a strategy or a habit. Because there is a difference between strategy and habit on the geopolitical chessboard, and that difference is intention married to consequence. A strategy produces intended outcomes. A habit produces familiar actions regardless of whether those actions produce anything useful. And what we have been watching in American foreign policy, particularly in the Gulf, for the better part of 2 decades, looks far more like institutional habit than coherent strategy. The military-industrial complex, the think tanks in Washington, the defense contractors in Northern Virginia, they have built an entire ecosystem around the logic of forward deployment. 2 destroyers near Iran is not just a tactical decision. It is the output of a bureaucratic organism that knows how to do one thing exceptionally well: project force. What it has never been particularly good at is converting that projected force into durable political outcomes. But here is where it gets genuinely interesting, and I want you to hold this thought because it connects directly to the critical realization I mentioned at the opening. While the USS whatever is cutting through the Strait of Hormuz, something else entirely is happening in the corridors of power in Beijing, Moscow, Riyadh, and, most fascinatingly, in Tehran itself. Iran just concluded its most significant trade and connectivity agreements in modern history. Its formal integration into the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is complete. Its bilateral trade with China now exceeds $40 billion annually and is growing. Russia and Iran have signed a comprehensive strategic partnership that covers defense, energy, and financial architecture. And crucially, Iran is actively participating in the construction of payment and settlement systems that do not route through the SWIFT network, which means American financial sanctions, the sharpest tool in Washington's non-military toolkit, are losing their cutting edge in real time. Now ask yourself this question, and I genuinely want you to think about this and share your perspective in the comments below. If your most powerful non-military tool, the ability to cut a nation off from the global financial system, is being systematically neutralized, what does it mean when you respond by sending warships? What exactly are those warships defending at that point? Because the chessboard has changed, the squares themselves have been rearranged. To understand that rearrangement, we have to look at the broader architecture of what is happening with the global monetary system, because that is the real theater of this conflict, not the Persian Gulf, not the Strait of Hormuz, not the flight paths of Iranian drones. The dollar's dominance as the world's reserve currency has been the invisible force multiplier behind every single American geopolitical action since Bretton Woods. It is what allows the United States to run perpetual current account deficits without facing the consequences that any other nation would face. It is what transforms American Treasury bonds into the world's safest asset. And it is what gives economic sanctions their teeth. Remove dollar dominance, and the entire architecture of American global power begins to shift, not collapse overnight, but shift, meaningfully and permanently. And that shift is underway. The numbers are no longer deniable. The dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has dropped from roughly 70% in 2000 to somewhere around 58% today. And that decline is accelerating, not plateauing. Saudi Arabia, America's most important Arab strategic partner, the cornerstone of the petrodollar system that Henry Kissinger engineered in the 1970s, has been actively negotiating oil sales in Chinese yuan. The BRICS nations, which now represent a larger share of global GDP in purchasing power parity terms than the G7, are building alternative trade settlement mechanisms, and Iran, sitting on some of the world's largest proven hydrocarbon reserves, is at the center of this alternative architecture precisely because it has had the most incentive and the most experience in building economic relationships that bypass the dollar. So when two guided missile destroyers appear near Iranian waters, you have to read that deployment against this backdrop. Because from Tehran's perspective, and I think this is critical for an American audience to genuinely internalize, those destroyers are not a deterrent. They are a confirmation. They confirm that the United States has no new strategic options. They confirm that Washington's response to Iranian strategic advancement is the same response it has been giving for 40 years. Naval presence. And in the calculus of a nation that has survived 40 years of sanctions, diplomatic isolation, proxy wars, and cyber attacks, a couple of destroyers in familiar waters registers not as a threat, but as a weather pattern. Predictable, manageable, already priced in. But let us not be naive about Iran either, because intellectual honesty demands that we look at Tehran with the same clear eyes we apply to Washington. Iran is not some innocent nation being bullied by imperial overreach, though that narrative has its adherents. Iran has its own imperial ambitions, its own brutal domestic repression, its own cynical use of proxy forces that have killed civilians across the region. The Houthis, who Iran arms and advises, have disrupted global shipping through the Red Sea in ways that have raised freight costs for the entire developing world, the very nations that the BRICS framework claims to champion. Iran's leadership is not a collection of philosopher kings navigating toward a just multipolar order. They are strategic actors pursuing their own interests, willing to use violence and coercion when it serves their purposes. The point is not to moralize, the point is to see clearly. And seeing clearly means recognizing that this confrontation in the Gulf is not between good and evil, it is between competing power structures, both of which have blood on their hands, and both of which are making calculations that have almost nothing to do with the welfare of ordinary people. Which brings me to a question that I think deserves serious reflection from everyone watching this. When we watch American destroyers and Iranian patrol boats playing their familiar games of maritime brinkmanship, who exactly is being protected? What interests are actually being defended out there in those waters? Because the freedom of navigation framing, as righteous as it sounds, deserves scrutiny. The United States Navy's presence in the Gulf has not prevented the Houthis from targeting commercial shipping. It has not prevented Iranian-backed forces from harassing tankers. What it has done, consistently and reliably, is project the image of American commitment, and that image is increasingly for domestic consumption as much as international deterrence. Because here is the domestic political dimension that almost never gets discussed with sufficient depth. American military deployments in the Middle East have a powerful function inside the American political system itself. They signal resolve, they demonstrate action, they provide the optics of strength in a media environment that rewards visible decisiveness over long-term strategic wisdom. And in an era where American domestic politics has become almost entirely performative, where the gap between action and theater has essentially closed, a naval deployment near Iran is as much a communication to voters in Michigan and Pennsylvania as it is a message to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. This is not cynicism. This is just the mechanics of how modern great power politics actually works when you strip away the ceremonial language. Now, I want to get to that critical realization I promised you because I think it reframes everything we have discussed. Here it is. The fundamental strategic challenge facing the United States in the Persian Gulf and in the broader Middle East is not Iran, It never was Iran, not really. The fundamental challenge is that the post-Cold War unipolar moment, during which the United States could deploy force essentially without strategic consequence because there was no credible counterbalancing power, is over. And the institutions, habits, doctrines, and bureaucratic reflexes that were built during that unipolar moment have not adapted to the new reality. They cannot adapt because adaptation would require acknowledging that the moment is over, and that acknowledgement is politically and institutionally catastrophic for everyone whose career, budget, and identity is built on the premise that American primacy is permanent. This is the real story behind two destroyers in the Gulf. It is not about Iran's nuclear program, though that is real and dangerous. It is not about freedom of navigation, though that matters economically. It is about an empire in the process of discovering, slowly, painfully, and with enormous institutional resistance, that the tools it mastered for a world that no longer exists are becoming progressively less effective in the world that does. And that discovery, my friends, is the most consequential geopolitical process of our lifetimes. Not a single dramatic collapse, but a long, grinding, occasionally violent process of strategic adaptation that neither Washington nor its adversaries fully control. Think about the chessboard again. For 30 years after the Soviet collapse, America was playing three-dimensional chess against opponents who were playing checkers. Not because they were stupid, but because they had no choice. The material and institutional gap was simply too large. But what happens when those opponents spend 30 years watching every American move, studying every American doctrine, analyzing every American strategic failure in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Libya, in Syria, and using that knowledge to build alternative architectures, alternative alliances, and alternative financial systems specifically designed to neutralize American advantages? What you get is the world we are living in right now. A world where American hard power remains formidable but increasingly struggles to translate into durable political outcomes. A world where the softer tools of economic coercion are losing their edge. And a world where the combination of those two trends creates a strategic paradox. The more Washington relies on the tools it still has, like naval deployments, the more it reveals the absence of the tools it has lost. And I want to ask you something directly, because I think the answer matters enormously for how Americans think about their own future. Does the United States have the political and institutional capacity to make the kind of strategic adaptation that this moment demands? Does Washington have the ability to move from a posture of dominance, where American rules are the world's rules and American preferences are enforced through financial and military power, to a posture of competitive engagement in a genuinely multipolar world? Because that transition, if it happens, will require something that is extraordinarily difficult for any great power to manufacture on demand: strategic humility. The willingness to say that the world has changed, that our tools have limits, and that durable security and prosperity require negotiation and accommodation as much as deterrence and projection. I am not holding my breath, frankly. Not because Americans lack the intelligence or the character for that kind of adaptation, they demonstrably do not, but because the political and institutional incentive structures in Washington actively punish strategic humility and reward the appearance of strength even when that strength is producing diminishing returns. The defense contractors need contracts, the think tanks need relevance, the politicians need sound bites. And we are deploying 2 guided missile destroyers is a much better soundbite than we are rethinking the foundational premises of our Middle East strategy in light of 30 years of evidence that those premises are not working. So what does this mean practically? What should a thoughtful American who cares about their country's long-term security and prosperity actually take away from watching 2 destroyers sail near Iranian waters? I think it means this: pay less attention to the deployment itself and pay more attention to what is not happening alongside it. Is there a credible diplomatic channel open with Tehran? Is there a serious multilateral framework being constructed to address the underlying security architecture of the Gulf in ways that all regional powers, including Iran, have reason to support? Is there a coherent American strategy for managing the transition from a dollar-dominated global financial system to whatever comes next in ways that protect American interests without triggering the kind of catastrophic financial disruption that nobody wants? If the answers to those questions are no, no, and no, and right now they largely are, then the destroyers are not a strategy, they are a placeholder, and placyboards eventually run out of room. The Persian Gulf has always been a place where global power contests play out in miniature, compressed into a body of water barely 300 miles wide, surrounded by some of the world's most volatile politics and most valuable hydrocarbons. Every major shift in global power since the Second World War has registered in those waters. The British withdrawal east of Suez in 1971, the Iranian Revolution of 1979 and the birth of the petrodollar system, the tanker wars of the 1980s, the Gulf War coalitions of the 1990s, the post-2003 reshaping of regional balances, and now this. American destroyers in familiar waters, Iran embedded in a new strategic architecture, and the whole region slowly, painfully reorienting toward a multipolar reality that nobody designed and nobody fully controls. Watch those waters carefully, not because the destroyers represent the next war, though that risk is always real and should never be dismissed, but because the Persian Gulf, right now, is the most honest mirror of where American power actually stands in the world. And what that mirror is reflecting back should prompt every thoughtful American to ask not just what our military is doing out there, but what we want from the world, what we are willing to offer it, and whether the gap between those two things is something we still have time to close. That is the real story. Everything else is the wake behind the ships.